So, I tried to write a script for this episode, and I wrote all the positives down because my theory when I walked into it was that Invincible was an okay series that had good and bad to it. And after writing down the good, I started trying to formulate all the bad. And I got more and more irrationally angry to the point where I could no longer work with the hypothesis that Invincible was a decent but flawed series. So, rather than write a script for this episode and get horribly irrationally angry, I'm instead going to just tell you all of my thoughts, and you'll get to enjoy me getting irrationally angry. Now, before I really get into this, I want to be clear that Invincible does have good parts to it. In fact, the good parts in my original thinking about it were as good, if not better, than the bad parts. And we'll get into that. But I do want to focus on the fact that there are really good parts to this series. Now, I read the whole thing, all 3 volumes, in a day. And I don't think the series was meant to be read that way. In fact, I really don't think the series was meant to be consumed all at once, just from how it's written. So if I forget things, it's because I consumed it very quickly within like 5 hours. And I honestly don't know how they're going to handle the animated series, because I haven't seen the animated series, and I don't know if they're going to change things or not, because I think they probably are going to need to if they're going to handle, a lot of the ideas and plot points in Invincible. So before we really get into it, I just want to make that clear. Now, the main thing that's good about Invincible, the main thing that I think you can really take away from it, is that there are really great characters in Invincible. There's really great character work, and it borders on being a shame that none of the great characters are our main character. And we'll get into that, but that's later. So, like, for example, one of the best characters is Mark's brother, who is the child of his father and an alien race of bug people, essentially. And, like, his entire arc, his entire character is great. There are moments, like, in the beginning where he's on Earth and he's like, why is killing wrong? And they have this huge discussion about, what it means, like, morality, and whether or not, morality is universal, or if morality is only applied to people of your own species, things like that. He's like, I'm not human, I'm not from Earth, I have no attachment to any of the living things on this planet, I do not care about your ideas of morality or your ethics, I do not care about any of this, and I do not understand why what you're saying is what I did was wrong. Like, there's this huge discussion, and it's poignant and well done, and slightly ruined by the fact that Mark Grayson is involved. And again, I'm not going to talk about Mark Grayson until we get to the bad parts, because that's an entire rant. Also, I have to point out there's going to be spoilers, because you can't talk about 3 volumes of a series without spoilers, so I hope you're ready for that. Okay, continuing. Another great character is this alien tiger guy who is, like, hyper-focused on violence and hyper-focused on, like, honorable battle and meeting his death. And he has perhaps what is the best fight in the series with Thrag, essentially. Like, they get on this planet and just start duking it out. And honestly, if the tiger guy was the main character, the series might be much better, because of all of the things you can say about him, he's, like, the most honest character in the series. He's like, I will kill anyone and do anything as long as as long as I'm allowed to fight things, and so long as that is true, we are allies. Like, he is one of the most interesting characters I think I've ever seen in fiction, in terms of, like, that archetype of the, like, battle-hungry berserker. Because, like, there's a scene where, like, he's fighting, like, when he starts to fight Thrag, and his girlfriend releases, like, alien monsters that tear open Thrag's abdomen, and, the tiger dude is like, I think his name's Battle Beast, he's like, I won't have my fight be sullied by, like, unfair play, and he rips open his own abdomen, because he's like, we're gonna fight this honorably, and then they continue fighting, and it's legit one of the coolest scenes in the entire thing. Alan the Alien's also really good, who is like a character who is like well thought out, who is like, I'm the paragon of my species, what am I allowed to do? I'm always put in bad situations, and he's always like the guy who's like, everything's complicated, and you need to think about, the consequences of your actions. And that really works. In fact, unfortunately, it works too well, because it, again, makes Mark look like an ass and an idiot. And I'm not going to get into that yet. But Alan the Alien is a great character. Another character is the leader of the Coalition of Planets before Alan, who's also a Virtumite. Virtue? I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's like a Virtumite? I don't know how to pronounce this. I would if I watched the animated series, but I didn't. So I don't know how to pronounce that correctly. I can pronounce it correctly in my head, but I can't pronounce it correctly in speaking. The fucking aliens is what I should put it at, despite the fact there's lots of aliens, but I guess I could call them Saiyans because they're so modeled off of, like, it's basically Dragon Ball Z. Like, the plot is essentially Dragon Ball Z, and we'll get into that. But, essentially the dude who runs the Coalition of Planets is like, my race were monstrosity. They were conquering the universe, and they needed to be stopped, and I realized that we were monsters, and so I created a virus with my own DNA in order to murder my own people. Like, I needed to commit genocide because they're monsters. And, like, he's right. Unfortunately, I'll get into this when we talk about Mark, but unfortunately, he didn't finish the job, which gave us Mark, and I'll talk about that when we get to it. Another really good thing that's handled is the interpersonal relationships, for the most part, between everybody except Mark, and I'll get into that. So, like, for example, like, it almost borders on one of the rules of fiction where you don't talk about better things in your series. Because, like, in movies, for example, you don't want to reference other movies, because, especially good movies, because it makes the audience think of them, and then compare your movie to whatever they're now thinking about. So, like, you don't want to reference a good movie in your crappy movie, essentially, even if your movie's not crappy, because it's going to make people think of how much they love the other movie, and they're nostalgic for it, and then they're going to be looking at your movie, and they're going to compare it, and it's not going to be fair. So, they're like, that's a principle in fiction. It's why you don't reference better books in your book, why you don't reference better movies in your movie, why you don't, just don't reference things, essentially. And the distilled version of that is, don't put ideas in your story that are more interesting than the main idea that you're writing. Because it will make people go, I'm interested in these subplots more than I'm interested in the main story, and they're always going to be unhappy that those subplots weren't the main story, especially if the main story is bad. You see this a lot in big overarching shows, for example, Game of Thrones, where the subplots are often more interesting than whatever the main plotline is supposed to be, especially at the end when the main plotline shit the bed, which, ironically, Invincible probably has a lot in common with Game of Thrones in that it completely shits the bed at the end. Well, we'll get to that when we talk about the bad stuff. The interpersonal relationships in Invincible are the strong point of the series, and the Virtumites, or whatever you want to call them, however you pronounce their fucking name, their story of coming to Earth and interacting with Earthlings is probably the most interesting part of the series. And I know that it's a very small part, but it's an interesting part because it raises a lot of ideas and a lot of questions. And there's a scene that sticks out in my head where, like, they come to Earth and they're like, we're going to interbreed with Earthlings. We're not going to introduce ourselves. We're not going to make a stink about it. We're not going to, like, take over your planet. We're just going to interbreed with people, and then we're going to leave the planet and with our offspring and go do our thing. And then The thing is, though, is that it's hinted at that the reason that Mark's father, Omni-Man, changed was because he had interpersonal relationships on Earth. Because the Virtumites, whatever you call them, don't have those interpersonal relationships in their natural society. It's essentially the Saiyan society from Dragon Ball Z. They're all about warriors and all about survival of the fittest and all about just, affection is wrong. It is a Spartan mentality taken to an extreme. And so they come to Earth and they start interbreeding and they start changing as individuals. And there's a scene where Thrag is dressing down 3 of his fellow, Virtumites, and he's like, you've become completely monogamous. You keep almost revealing yourself, and you won't even interbreed with anybody. And the guy who's monogamous is like, yeah, it's like, I'm monogamous now because I found a mate, and I don't want to hurt her, and I don't want to interbreed with anybody else. I found a mate, I'm happy, I don't want to, interbreed with anybody. The second guy's like, yeah, I know we're not supposed to use our powers and reveal ourselves, but every time that I've used my abilities, it's because one of my mates was in danger, and I didn't want something to happen to them. And he's like, Thrag is like, you can get more. There are more mates out there. There are lots of human women. And he's like, I don't want more. I want the ones that I have. And the woman is like, all of these guys are awful. Every guy I've met is either weak or objectifies me and doesn't see me as an individual, as a warrior. And it's belittling and awful, and I hate it. And like, this archetype, this idea of these are aliens that have no concept of like social interaction that isn't based around hierarchy, coming into a place and developing individualism, like individuality. Like, they go from a collectivist society where everything is about the strongest and everything is about for the society, and they enter a society that is individualistic, and how that changes them is a way more interesting story than the story we have. Because it's about Mark, and Mark is terrible, and we'll get into that. Also, trigger warning now, because we're going to talk about the woman, and we have to have a trigger warning here about rape. So if you're uncomfortable with rape, trigger warning now. Because it's a main plot point, and it's handled well. As much as I hate to say that the rape subplot is a positive, it's how it's handled, and the things they talk about, which are well done. So, we'll just get into it. So, there's a subplot where the woman is interested in Mark. Mark is in a relationship with another woman already, and, he's not interested in her, and basically her whole thing is, he's the strongest person on Earth, and he's the only one I want to have sex with, and I'm going to do what is our custom in our society, which means I'm going to physically force myself upon him, and if he's strong enough to get me off, then he is. Then he wins. If he's not, then I'm going to be impregnated with his seed. And they do the whole scene where she kicks the crap out of him and forces herself on him. And in full fairness to the series, it's handled pretty well, with him becoming closed off and like uncomfortable with physical touch. And, when he finally like talks about it with his wife and everything else and everything that happened, it's well done, in my opinion, about his vulnerability and him being vulnerable. And, there's a lot of poignancy to it that I think works. I think what's a missed opportunity, and again with they're more interesting than Mark's story of the other aliens, the woman Virtumite who rapes him, the next time we see her, unfortunately, because they cut from her doing this to the next time we see her, she has already had his kid, and she's in a relationship with somebody else, and she's like the person I used to be scares me. Like, she's talking about how she's changed as an individual after having a kid and being in a relationship and being like, the woman who I was a monster. And she was terrifying, and she scares me, and I'm haunted by her. Like, it's poignant, and it works. Unfortunately, this is just a way to be lazy and cause her to sacrifice herself so that she never gets to tell Mark that she's sorry for what she did to him. Because that would have been way better than her dying. Let's put it that way. Her dying, like, undercuts all of the good, in a sense, because she only gets to say this to his wife, which isn't nearly as good. And another thing is that Omni-Man himself is a pretty great character, in that he develops a lot as it goes on, and he becomes he starts off as a terrible character because he's just evil Superman, essentially, and he changes as the series goes on to be a more well-rounded character, to the point where when he dies, it's really stupid, and it's almost insulting that they killed him, because, like, so much, like, his character is so much better than what happened to him. Another interesting thing about it is that he had the wherewithal and the intelligence to write fiction about all the things that could kill his race, which is an interesting point they don't delve into enough. Because it's weird that he both, like, writes all these books about how these things can kill his people, and at the same time goes through with the plan to, like, kill the Global Guardians, which is stupid and weird. And I don't really know why. Like, he's like, I had to act on as soon as I knew you had powers, I needed to act on my original, my original mission. And I'm like, that doesn't make any goddamn sense at all. There's another great character in the series that's honestly, again, ruined by Mark a little bit, and it's the Tyrannosaurus character, where he's like a were-Tyrannosaurus, and he has two personalities, and he's dedicated completely to saving the Earth in his own way. Basically, the Tyrannosaurus guy is like, is his name Dinosaurus, I think his name is, and he's basically like, the world is going to end because humans are going to destroy the world. Humans are polluting the world. They're going to destroy themselves. It's up to me to save the world through any means necessary. And he's a little bit like Poison Ivy, in a sense, where he says that environmentalist bent to him, but he's like, he levels Las Vegas and turns it into like a glass mirror that develops like solar power, and then like, things like that. He floods the eastern seaboard because he like, by melting the glaciers to teach humans a lesson and things like that. Like, he has a lot of interesting bits. He has a lot of interesting quirks to his character and his interactions, where he's like, there are ways for me to save the world without killing people. Like, Mark has this whole plot with him where Mark's like, there are ways for you to do what you're doing without killing people, and then he kind of in the end goes back to, no, there isn't. And they have this fight where Mark's basically like, you're not actually saving the world, you're just putting it off, because they're not actually like fixing anything. And then Mark has to kill him, and it's like, again, this is one of the problems with Mark, and we'll get into this later, but like, the character himself of a guy who wants to save the world but thinks that it's kind of hopeless and that humans can't be saved from themselves is a very interesting way to go about it. And I think, honestly, he's a great character. There's a number of other characters that have similar interesting stories. There's Monster Girl, who has an interesting arc of her. I think she reminds me a bit about the Hammerverse, in this one girl who is like always turns into a girl when she turns into a superpower, no matter how old she gets. And it annoys her that she's trapped in the body of a child despite being like 70. Like, similar thing with Monster Girl, where every time she uses her powers, she gets younger. And it annoys her because she's like 30. But then, like, you know, they fix that, and there's a whole development. Robot's another interesting one, where his thousands of years in another dimension with Monster Girl taught him essentially that he needs to be a monster, despite the fact he used to be a monster and then cloned himself into the body of one of his friends. There's a lot of interesting good character work. I could like talk about the character work in its own video probably, because there's so much of it that's good, and it almost makes you want to read it because there's a lot of complex ideas being thrown around. And so when I say that the characters are great, I mean that. And when I talk about all the bad, it mostly comes down to Mark, and we'll get into that. But all of the good that I've just talked about, again, boils down to these are great characters, and do you like them in spite of the bad in which I'm going to talk about? Because I keep having to beat around the bush, because so much of this comes down to the bad that I'm going to talk about, and it's mostly Mark Grayson. It's mostly Invincible himself. Okay. Let's talk about Mark, because Mark Grayson is one of the worst characters I think I've ever seen as a protagonist. He is a terrible character as a protagonist. He is one of the dumbest protagonists I think I've ever had to read. He is monumentally stupid. He is always doing the wrong thing. Like, if you said, like, in any situation that he's involved in, he will always do the wrong thing. He is always convinced that he's right. In my mind, he's a lot like Rorschach from Watchmen, in that he fervently believes that he is always correct. He always believes with a, like, almost sociopathic or psychopathic levels of self-confidence that he is correct in everything he does, that he is always in the right, and he's always wrong. Always. He always makes the choice that doesn't make any sense. He always makes the choice that everyone else is telling him, you're a moron, and this is a bad idea. And he goes, I'm right, fuck you, and then does the thing, and guess what? Everyone is always right. And he never learns. He never gets any better. He starts the series off as an idiot, clueless kid who's a teenager, and you can kind of forgive it. And he's like the same when he's 40. And it would be almost forgivable if the series was trying to hammer home a point that he's a moron and good intentions are not the same thing as ability or wisdom. Like, just because you have good intentions doesn't mean you're wise enough to do the thing that you should do. If the series was about people with great power being not actually having great responsibility because their belief that they have responsibility makes them do stupid or evil things, would be poignant, but that's not what the series goes for. In fact, the series has one of the most insulting endings I think I've ever read in a series, and we're going to get into that. But Mark is one of the most infuriating characters in the entire series, because he's always doing the wrong thing. Always. I can't hammer that home enough. He's always doing the wrong thing. For example, one of the main, like, the Dinosaurus thing, his whole arc of, like, he destroys Las Vegas and Mark fails, and he's sad that he failed, and then he goes to Las Vegas and sees that the destruction of Las Vegas means that they can produce enough solar energy to like completely power, like, the entire West Coast. And it's like, and Mark, rather than having the logical thought of, why couldn't we just do this somewhere else? Because it's just a giant sheet of glass. Why did we have to destroy a city for this? Mark goes, he was right. Like, and Mark begins to think that Dinosaurus is completely correct, and that he can be turned to good, and that his ideas that he can destroy, like, his ideas, while destructive, will save the world. If he could just not kill anybody, would be better. Which is completely fucking insane. It is entirely batshit, and literally everyone tells him this. Everybody's like, he's insane. He literally has no morality other than trying to save the world by killing as many people as possible. And you want to take him and give him all of the tools that he could use to do this because you think you're strong enough to keep him in line. And Mark's like, absolutely. Now, there's another wrinkle to this, because Dinosaurus, as I mentioned earlier in the good part, was a were creature in that he has two personalities. His main personality is just a dude who transforms into Dinosaurus when he becomes uninterested. So, like, when he feels apathy, when he becomes completely apathetic, he turns into a creature that is completely dedicated and full of motivation to do something, essentially. And the problem is that he absolutely hates Dinosaurus. He views his condition as a curse. He views his other side as a monster, and he has no control over his other side. He completely hates his other side and does not want to use him. And Mark basically goes, too fucking bad, man. I need your other side to save the world. So he breaks him out of prison, makes him feel apathetic against his will, to turn him into Dinosaurus against his will, and then kills him later when it obviously doesn't work out, because Dinosaurus is a psychopath. To put it in another way, to use another analogy, imagine if the Joker was cured. And I don't mean like it was a plot line. I don't mean like the White Knight story. I like where it's like a whole like game or whatever. I mean like if he was completely 100%, no joke, no plot line, like he was completely cured of all the chemicals and he went back to being a completely normal person, and he was like working a 9-to-5 job and being a completely normal guy. And then Batman, for some reason, decided that actually reality is broken and I need the Joker. And so, against his will, kidnapped the Joker, who was now cured, and threw him back into the chemicals against his will. Because that's basically what Mark does. Mark takes a guy who absolutely wants to be locked away because he thinks he's a monster and does not want to hurt anybody, and Mark makes him hurt millions of people. Mark takes him and says, actually, you're going to save the world whether you like it or not, because your other side, which is a psychotic dinosaur who wants to kill millions of people, if not billions of people, needs to be free. And then he does exactly that, and Mark kills him for it. Because Mark is an idiot and is always wrong. Okay? There's another scene that I talked about earlier with his brother, where Mark takes his brother, who is a child, who's not human, is the child of an alien race which lives no longer than a few months in human time, and brings him to Earth. He's purple, he has all the superpowers that everybody else in, Omni-Man's race does, and, his first outing, he kills a guy who is going to kill other people. And so they have this talk at night after the fact, where he's like, you can't kill people. Killing people is morally wrong. And he's like, why? And basically what he says is, he's like, look, I'm not a part of the human race. I'm disgusted by them. I don't feel any attachment to them. I see no reason why I need to play by human rules. And Mark basically flies off the handle and starts yelling at him about how he can't be a monster, how he's like, he'll get put away forever, how he needs to be human and fit in, and he basically whines at him. He doesn't give any, like, good reason for why killing is morally wrong. Because the answer to the question is, why is killing morally wrong, is because it's essentially theft. Because you're taking somebody else's life, and you don't have a right to do that. Just because you have power doesn't mean you have a right to kill other people who you see as beneath you. The correct answer is, imagine if their father, Omni-Man, had seen his mother's race, which were basically insects, and decided that because they were weaker than him, he could just exterminate them with will. Would that be morally permissible? The answer to that obviously would be no. And so the reason why you shouldn't kill people when you have the option not to is because it's not right for you to use your powers in such a way that you make the choice. You have to believe, like, you shouldn't make the system all about you, essentially. It's an argument about personal responsibility. But Mark is incapable of making this argument. Mark is incapable of being rational because Mark is an idiot. And so he basically whines at his brother and makes it all about himself, which is something he always does. Mark is very self-centered and always talks about every problem as though it's only about him. And that continues on, like, over and over again. Like, another thing that happens later is there's a guy whose power is that he can go into other dimensions. And so he goes to every dimension, and like all these other dimensions, and he finds himself. And he basically says, we're all geniuses. We're going to fuse ourselves into one person. And with all that knowledge, we're going to save the world and the multiverse, essentially. When he does that, it goes wrong because of Invincible showing up to fight two other guys who want to kill Invincible. And he becomes, in his mind, a monster because he's deformed. Never mind the fact that his whole plan was to fuse hundreds of minds into his own, and somehow he didn't think that was going to change him physically. You would think, as a genius, he could have been like, I'm going to, with my genius level intellect and ability to go to any dimension, I can just fix my physical form by figuring out a way. But no, he doesn't, because he becomes a monomaniacal villain who essentially hates Invincible. And there's this scene where he shows up, Invincible's wife is pregnant, and he's like, I'm going to kill you and your child to get back at Invincible. And his wife looks at this villain who wants to kill her and her child, and she talks to him like a human being. Not as a crazy person, but as a human being. And proves that she's a much better character than Mark is, because she basically goes, you wanted to save the world. Isn't that why you turned yourself into this? Isn't this why you went to all this trouble? And he's like, yeah, you're right, I did want to save the world. And she's like, so why are you wasting your time doing this? And he's like, you're right. I shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. And my actions are a problem. And he disappears. And Mark, being the colossal idiot that he is like, I need to hunt this man down and murder him. Because if I don't, he might come back and kill my wife and child and me. And his wife is like, you're an idiot. Don't do that. He's gone. Deal with it. If he comes back, deal with him. But don't go away. Don't leave. Basically, like, she's pregnant. She's ready to have a kid. And she's like, absolutely do not leave me and your unborn child to go chase another dude across dimensions for no reason, essentially. Absolutely do not go through with this. Do not do this. It's a stupid idea. And you would be betraying me, your unborn child, and everybody who depends on you, because you can't give it up. And Mark goes, I'm going to leave you, my unborn child, and disappoint everybody who believes in me, to chase down a dude who has now told him that he's no longer interested. Because Mark is only about Mark and can never think of another human being except himself. And what this results in is Mark being betrayed by Robot, because Robot is a psychopath and it's been building forever to Robot being evil, essentially. And Robot betrays him in another dimension and basically leaves him for dead. I don't know why he doesn't kill him. I guess because I guess he just doesn't kill him out of, respect, but essentially Mark disappears for, 10 months, and everyone thinks he's dead, and essentially everything that his wife said was going to happen happened, because everybody else is smarter than Mark, and the series wants to repeat this over and over again, about how stupid and self-centered Mark is. Another thing that comes out later is that Mark as a character, doesn't learn. One of the things you would think is, what you would think is, when you find, one of the big twists is that it turns out that Mark is actually a descendant of the, emperor or someone of the old planet before everything bad happened. He's got the same genetics as the former emperor, and Thrag can't deal with that. And a good way of telling that story is again, it's basically Dragon Ball Z. You remember in Dragon Ball Z, for example, there's this whole thing about Goku, who's an alien of a warrior race who comes to Earth supposedly to conquer the planet, decides not to, and when he finds out that he's a Super Saiyan, that he's not the legendary Super Saiyan, but Broly wasn't introduced yet. When he finds out that he's a Super Saiyan, and Vegeta goes, "You need to save our race," Goku goes, "That's stupid, and I'm absolutely not going to do that." And that's the whole point of why Goku works as a character. Because despite all of Goku's power, he doesn't see his role as a conqueror. He doesn't see his role as, I am going to take over the world and do whatever I want. He says, what's important to me are the people close to me and the people whose opinions I value. And that's what makes him work as a character. Mark, on the other hand, would have done the complete opposite. Now, to get into some really deep spoilers of Volume 3, the last, 3 to 4 issues are horribly insulting. So, there's this whole thing throughout the entire series that's trying to say that being on Earth, Mark is different from Thrag. Thrag is essentially Frieza, let's say, in this analogy. Because Thrag believes that winner takes all, the might is what's important. And that it's important that essentially his race of people, because they're stronger, should reconquer the universe. They should essentially repopulate and then conquer the universe. That's what he believes. And he goes out of his way to constantly reinforce this notion. And there's this running thing where Mark fundamentally believes that Thrag is a psychopath and that he's wrong. And you think that it's going to be okay, Mark is going to be different. Mark is going to be our moral paragon, essentially, despite the fact that he's always been a moron about every other issue up to this point. And there comes a point where the coalition of planets, before his allies, are basically this race of people is so dangerous, we absolutely cannot let them reproduce, because Thrag is going to immediately try to take over the universe and kill untold quintillions of planets worth of people. Because that's what he does. And that's what he wants to do. And he doesn't make a secret that he's going to do this. And so the coalition of planets goes, okay, we have a virus that will kill all of them. But what may happen, because human DNA is so similar, because it's always fucking similar, to whatever alien race, they mesh with in every, like, this is a weird, as an aside, it's always weird that, like, humans, for some reason, whenever there's another humanoid civilization, they're like, yeah, your DNA is roughly the same. But anyway, so, like, the Vertumite? I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm never going to pronounce this correctly. Thrag's fucking space race of aliens are essentially mostly human in their DNA. And so the virus that would kill them may possibly kill untold billions, trillions worth of humans. And that's bad. As you can imagine, them releasing a virus on Earth, killing everybody on the planet to kill all of these aliens is a no-go with Mark. as you can reasonably assume that the disease designed to wipe out all of humanity might be a no-go with Mark. And it's portrayed as the coalition of planets is doing something that's morally wrong out of their own self-interest. As in, essentially the argument goes, this race of people was so dangerous they nearly killed, they tried to conquer the universe, and could have succeeded if not for the fact that they were all wiped out by this virus. Now they're going to reproduce, and we have to stop that we have to stop that no matter what. Even if it destroys us, we need to stop this. And Mark's argument is that his father changed, he changed, his brother changed. What if being on Earth, they will all change? An argument which is true, believe it or not, which actually comes to pass where all of the others, because they interact with people on Earth, because they are now for the first time exposed to emotion and exposed to, like, actually caring about other people and people caring about them on a personal level, develop emotion, which you might call humanity, essentially. And so Mark's correct, except he fucks it all up, and the series kind of okay. So let's talk about the ending, because I have to. So basically, Mark realizes after this point, after they have a fight with Thrag, and and they kill Thrag, and they fight on the sun, and it's meant to be epic, but it's kind of weird because, like, sometimes random blows from human creatures can bruise him, and other times he does things like fight on the sun for long periods of time. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's meant to be, like, basically under the principle of awesome, and it kind of works. But anyway, he kills Thrag on the sun, and basically says, we can't live on Earth. We're not human. We can't live on Earth because our children are going to reproduce, they're going to gain superpowers, and this many people who all have superpowers are going to make the humans feel threatened by them. And, that's a poignant argument. They're going, so what we should do is we should go and find a different planet and live with them. Now, in fairness to this argument, during the fight with Thrag finds out the planet, where Mark's brother was born, and so he goes to that planet and basically just starts fucking every living thing and produces like 40,000 children who are all purple, and he's like, okay, I now produced all these children, and I'm gonna go conquer the Earth now and everyone else because I've now found a source for infinite of our new race. And so Mark's basically left with, not just the ones that came with Thrag who are now socialized, but also all of these purple children who are not, and who are, who obviously can't live on Earth. The population of a small town full of super powerful beings can't all live on Earth. It didn't work for Thor and the Asgardians when they moved to wherever in the Midwest, and it's not going to work for them. So he's like, we need to leave and go to find our own planet and, like, live there and be our own people. And this works. Except Mark decides that because he is so powerful and so moral and so right all the time, that it's up to him to bring peace to the universe. Now, you may realize that having a guy who's ultra powerful, who looks out at the universe and goes, you know what the world universe needs? Me, is not a hero. We would call that a dictator. And that's what Mark does. And so for the last 4 issues of Invincible, Mark essentially decides that he's going to conquer the universe. And he's going to be the moral leader to put the universe under his rule and create infinite peace. And this is portrayed as a good thing. It's not. Okay, Mark becomes what is essentially a dictator, going to planet and giving them the same choice that Thrag did to every other people of basically, you will join us and be peaceful, or we will destroy you. And he gives them all that choice. And it's portrayed as different when it's not at all. They spend the whole series having Mark be a guy going, Thrag is wrong, he's a monster, and he needs to be stopped. To the point where he's against working with Thrag during the times where they have common enemies. Like, when the coalition of planets is gonna, just completely wipe out humanity, he's like, me and Thrag are on the same side now, and I hate it, but we have to do it. There are so many situations where they go, Thrag is a monster, and then Mark has this great idea in his brain where he's like, actually, I could do it better than him. He's like, the coalition of planets is just this whole huge planet, and, this coalition of planets is bleeding other planets dry, and it's wrong. So I'm going to beat up Alan the alien and destroy the coalition of planets to force them, under penalty of me killing them, to change what they're doing so they're no longer doing this. And it's portrayed as, I just need to talk to them, but it boils down, it doesn't boil down to talking. It boils down to Mark beating up people and then extending his hand and going, why don't we talk about this so I don't have to keep punching you in the face? That's it's the logic of an abusive spouse. If you make me keep punching you, we're never going to have peace. Just stop doing things I dislike, and I will stop punching you. That's what Mark's logic boils down to. And it's portrayed as being a good thing. And it's insulting. It is insultingly infuriating. There's a scene where he's on a planet of people who are warlike, and one of his daughters is fighting this champion and beats them. And the king of this planet is amazed. He's like, wow, what a species, what a great warrior your people must be, what a great warrior your daughter is to beat, our champion. And Mark looks at him and goes, yeah, actually, we're all like that. I'm actually the strongest of I'm actually stronger than her. And the king instantly swears allegiance. And it's portrayed as, well, actually, this is a different way. This is a different way than what Thrag did. And it's not. This is the same thing of pointing a nuke at somebody and saying, you can join us or I can destroy you. And I mentioned Dragon Ball Z, and essentially imagine if it's on Namek and Goku is fighting Frieza, and Frieza's like, I'm the strongest, therefore I should rule the universe. And Goku kills him, and then sits there for a moment and thinks, actually, he was totally right. I'm the strongest, so I should rule the universe. And basically just continues on what the Saiyans did by conquering the rest of the universe. And this is portrayed as a good thing. Imagine if that had been the story of Dragon Ball Z, because that's the story of Invincible. Invincible is Mark Grayson deciding that he is smarter and more moral and better than everyone else, and that only he can bring peace to the universe, and then forcefully imposing his will upon the universe. He essentially believes that great power means great responsibility, and that responsibility is to teach you about my power under any means necessary. And it's portrayed like this is okay. Alan's like, yeah, maybe we should talk and be friends now that you've shown up and had a physical altercation with me and wanted nothing more than to demolish our entire way of life because you think it's wrong. Mark is never shown to be... Mark's problem is that every other time in the series, as I mentioned, he's always wrong. Every time. He is never correct. Every time he opens his mouth, every time he does something, every time he chooses a path, it's always the wrong choice. People other than him suffer for it. Everybody around him suffers. His wife, his children, his brother, everybody either has their life ruined or they die because of him. Because of his choices, and because he can never accept that he might be wrong. And everybody around him constantly tells him, you might be wrong, and if you're wrong, lots of other people are going to suffer, and Mark doesn't care. Mark does not care at all. It does not bother him. He never learns from his mistakes. He never learns to be a better person. He never learns to stop and think, maybe I'm not the smartest person in every room I walk into. Because he's always thinking that whatever he believes at that moment is the truth and the greatest solution to every problem. And he's always wrong. And at the very end of the series, it goes from, actually, he's always right. Actually, being a dictator is totally good, and forcibly imposing your will on other people is totally right. And actually, if you just beat the shit out of them and say, hey, can't we talk now? They'll totally agree with you. That's how Invincible ends. Invincible ends with Mark Grayson, Emperor of the Universe. And it's insulting, and it's aggravating. Because this is not a character who you want to see succeed. As I mentioned, he's insufferable. And every character he encounters is better and has a better grasp of morality than him. It would be like if you boiled down, major conflicts in human history to why don't we just all get along? There are serious repercussions to every action you take, and you can't solve every problem like this, and the series basically goes, actually, you totally can. Imagine if we were, it'd be like if they, the Chinese have a problem with Taiwan, but, if we just nuke both parties and then bring them all into a room and say, why don't we all just get along, that would work. This is basically what the series is saying. Because that's what Mark does. Mark basically forcibly, under penalty of death, essentially. He never actually is shown doing this, but he does it physically. It's not shown that he's murdering lots of people, but it's implied every time he talks that the penalty for not going along with him is him destroying them. And essentially, he's become Thrag, and you can do a story like that. You can absolutely do a story where your protagonist is corrupted and becomes the monster he's always fought against. And that story's been done hundreds of times. It's been done so many times that it's boring now. The evil Superman trope has been done so many times that it's boring and repetitive. That's the story of things like Injustice. And I hate Injustice. But Injustice, at least, grapples with the notion of it deals with flawed characters who they're willing to accept are wrong. They're willing to accept that the characters who are undergoing this know what they're doing is wrong, but they feel they have to do it. Mark believes that what he's doing is 100% correct and everyone else is wrong. And if they can't see it, he just needs to beat it into them. And it's portrayed as if this is a good thing. It's portrayed as if he's the protagonist. It borderline feels like a country's propaganda. Okay? It borderline, the last 4 issues of Volume 3 feel like they're trying to make a dictator. They're trying to, sell you a dictator. Look at how good and moral our emperor is, going to other places and bringing freedom to them under the penalty of death. If you could interchange some of the dialogue in the last 4 issues of Volume 3 with propaganda out of a communist country. You could change it with propaganda about like Chinese propaganda or North Korean propaganda or Soviet propaganda, you could just interchange it completely, because it's not, it sounds exactly the same. And I think what bothers me so much is that it's not, the story it's not telling is, at the end of the day, power corrupts, and just because you think you're the best, you're not. Just because you think you're moral doesn't mean you are. And you will do terrible things believing you're moral, believing you are more moral than everyone else, believing you are the only one with the solutions, will always result in tragedy. And that is not the story they tell. The story they tell is, having power is awesome, and if you have power, you are liberated to do whatever you think is best. And you should not feel bad about this. If you're stronger than other people, you should just do whatever you want to them. If you think that it's better for other people to live under your iron boot, then they should. That's what Invincible's about. That's what Invincible basically boils down to in the last volume. And it's insulting. It's revolting. It is so very terrible. And again, I think most of it is that it's portrayed with such a happy face. It's portrayed as being like, isn't it great how Mark decides to enslave the universe under his will and tell them that what they're doing is wrong, and that if he decides that what they're doing is wrong, then it is, and that the only thing that needs to decide whether something's right or wrong is whether or not Mark thinks it is, because that's all it is. Mark decides that these people are wrong, and that their morals are wrong, their religions are wrong, the way they live is wrong, and because Mark thinks that, Mark is right, and they are wrong. And that's the whole story. That's all it boils down to. It's infuriating. I know I keep repeating that, but it is beyond sickening. It is beyond, like, insulting. And maybe it would work so much better if, like, this story would work so much better if Mark died. And I mean this. Like, if what happened was Mark had a dream about a piece of their people being peaceful and, being an example to the universe. And they're a very long-lived species. So it's like, being an example to the universe, and then he dies. And everyone can only remember him as a beacon of morality. And because, like 2 or 3 generations later, when they've been, like, nobody of the youngest generation remembers him personally. None of them were alive when he was. And so all they know is the stories people have told about how great he was. That they take those stories and decide that because of these morals, because he was such a moral person, because they, being his descendants, are so moral that they then have to go out and do exactly the same things that Thrag did. And that history repeats itself when you don't learn the right lessons. It's not about forgetting history, it's about learning the wrong lessons from history. That would be that's the same story that they're telling of a race of people taking over the universe, about things repeating themselves, but you do it without insulting the reader. You do it without basically saying that actually Mark's full of shit. And for 2 volumes of your series, with every decision he makes, and then at the last second change your mind and go, actually, Mark's always right. Never mind all of the dead bodies. Never mind all of the people who he's stepped on. Actually, he's way more moral than them. And really, it's their fault for not being so moral like Mark is. It is infuriatingly bad. And, when I said at the beginning of this, I tried to write a script, and I tried to write about why I thought that Invincible was an okay series and not like a great series or a terrible series. That was when I finished and I sat down, and that was my gut reaction finishing it. But I think I've made it clear that having discussed it in detail, it's an awful series. Like, there's good parts of it. There are parts of this series that are great and I love. And, like, those parts, it's almost worth reading for almost. But the change in, like, the last 4 issues, where it feels like they're speed running their series and major parts are missing, and it's basically like a smiley face dictatorship, and actually Mark was right the whole time, is so insultingly bad, and such a terrible ending. I would compare it to Game of Thrones, where the whole ending feels rushed. Everything that they've tried to, like, they've talked about, everything they've done, they just completely and totally, like, upended. Like, imagine if at the end of Game of Thrones, Daenerys was, like, torched King's Landing and turned into a psychopath, and the series went, actually, she's right. Actually, she's totally right. And she then conquers all of the world. Like, imagine if that was the ending to Game of Thrones, because that's the ending to Invincible. Imagine if Daenerys was right, burned King's Landing, kills Jon Snow and everyone who believed in her, and the series went, actually, she's the moral right. She's the moral core of our series, and her conquering the world under penalty of being burned by dragons is morally correct. That's Invincible in a nutshell. And it's terrible, and I hate it. I don't know how to say it anymore. I don't know how to say it anymore. It's awful, and I hate it, and I can't talk about it anymore. Don't read it. It's terrible. If you're interested in it, if you're interested in parts of it, read the Cliff Notes version, read the wiki. Don't read the series, please. It's so terrible. Like, because you'll be like me, you'll read it and you'll be infuriated by this character. Everything about it. There's major parts I've left out. I left out the part where they bring other versions of Mark from other universes where he's evil and they conquer the world, basically, and kill lots of people. And it's pointed out that in more universes, he's evil in more universes than good. In, like, more universes, he conquers the Earth, essentially. Like, in other like, there's so much that's bad. Like, it's just, God, I hate that. I really thought I didn't like, I thought the series was okay, and then I'm losing my voice because I'm so mad. I'm just so mad about it. Okay, that's enough. Bye.